class.
Yeah, I made them broken. It was
yeah. But anyway, moving on. So there are 5 different editions. We'll start from ground 1, first edition, which is the first D&D game that came out long time ago. I can't remember when. I think it was 1979. I know I have it written down
I'll pull up
somewhere.
The Wikipedia article I was looking
But anyway, first edition, which it was not called first edition at the time, of course, because when you are in the first edition of something, you don't call it the first edition. That's like calling World War I at the time. They didn't call it that. They called it the Great War because they didn't think they were going to have another one. Just like D&D, you didn't think you were going to have another one. With video games nowadays, we see things like Minecraft 1.0, sort of, like an expectation that there's going to be a second edition. But at this time when D&D was created, it was still in the, not quite in the infancy, but still in the juvenile age of role-playing games and gaming in general, so it was not common for something to have a second edition or future onto it, so they weren't expecting to change it. So it was just first edition. It was just called Basic Dungeons and Dragons. It wasn't even really called that at first. It was just Dungeons and Dragons. So first edition is actually a conglomeration of a couple of the different times they tried Dungeons and Dragons to reiterate it. Mostly consisting of the original Dungeons and Dragons, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons First Edition, and D&D Basic Set.
To give you a time frame, the original Dungeons & Dragons came out in 1974, and then they split into 2 versions. I was
5 years off.
What?
I was 5 years off. I said 1979.
Well, at 1977 came Advanced Dungeons & Dragons and Dungeons & Dragons Basic.
Right. So, to give an idea also, even during second edition, they weren't really naming them first and second edition yet, because I know that Dad always just knew them all as Dungeons and Dragons, and like Basic and Advanced. It was just kind of called Basic Dungeons and Dragons for first edition and Advanced Dungeons and Dragons for second edition. And I know that we played Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Maybe Dad also played Basic Dungeons and Dragons. I'm not really sure, but the way he played for us was more in line with second edition. So that's the one I know better. I'm saying that because my dad might be listening tonight. I really hope he is. I don't think he saw my messages, but if he is, hi, Dad. Oh, by the way, my name is Drew Sherrod. I don't know if I said that, but anyway. Oh, my dad just texted me that he is listening. Cool. There were like 3 iterations. There was original Dungeons and Dragons, and in the original Dungeons and Dragons, there was just 3 classes, sort of. There was Cleric, Fighting Man, and Magic User.
Yes.
Which I just laugh a lot at Fighting Man.
Fighting Man
it's pretty funny. It's just every warrior class that has been created since then in D&D. And then they kind of upped it a little bit in Advanced D&D First Edition, which was it had Bard, Cleric, Monk, which I was surprised at that. I didn't know Monk was that early. I thought that came around like at least in second edition, but apparently it existed a long time ago. Thief instead of Rogue. It wasn't called Rogue yet. Fighter and Magic User. And then those had a couple of offshoots as well. I know Thief had the Assassin subcategory and stuff like that. And then there was the D&D Basic Set, which the D&D Basic Set was what I would see as the true start of like the first edition. But it was also weird. It had the 4 basic classes that people think of, which are Thief, Magic User, Fighter, and Cleric. But then it also had Druid on top of that. It also had a weird thing back then was that, at least that one, I'm not sure about the other 2, it had races as classes. You couldn't really be not a human and a different class. You could be a human fighter, human in Cleric, human Magic User, all of that. Or you could be a dwarf, you could be an elf, or you could be a halfling, which is a hobbit. Which is weird to me. Experience back then was more based on finding treasure than actually battling monsters. So the site I was reading said that was kind of why there were differences in that. I don't know. But it was very, how to explain, very small and simple compared to what we have now.
Oh yeah.
There was a limited, far more limited leveling system than what you and me are used to. There was only 10 levels, but what was really cool about it was that each of the levels had their own like name. Like a thief became like I don't remember all the names, but eventually like the 10th level thing was when you actually got the name like Rogue or Ranger or something like that. Nice. Actually 9th level you got it, and then at 10th level you became a Ranger Lord. Yeah, Ooh. It was pretty cool. Each level had its own particular name. Kind of like I mean you haven't played this, but some people might have. Kind of like the different class names in Fire Emblem.
Oh yeah, yeah. I haven't played Fire Emblem, Drew.
Have you?
Excuse me.
I don't know. I don't remember.
Excuse me.
I don't remember. But yeah.
So
they kind of ranked up. Leveling up was way more of a big thing back then to level up. Mm-hmm. Nowadays it happens every 3 or 4 games, at least early levels. It gets harder as you continue to level up. But back then it was like quite a few games of play before you leveled up.
Longer to become.
There was limited character customization back then, which was fine. There were only like 6 to 8 classes, and once you choose your class, that was it. You didn't really get a lot of choices beyond that. There was limited. There was also a lot of limitations, and this lasted for quite some time on like alignment and classes, and like what races could be certain classes as well. Which that has changed over time. Mm-hmm. Also, back in this first edition, one thing I'll say that I don't like about first edition, and kind of second edition too, is I'm sorry, I apologize to all the older people listening, but magic users were terrible. I'm sorry. They got one spell every day. They got essentially one spell that they could use every day. And it was really powerful depending on what they gathered for that day. But it was just, you couldn't do anything else the rest of the day once you used it, or even before you used it. So, like, it's not necessarily a bad design where they get one big fire or power of a thing to use once in a day and they save everybody. That's awesome. But then that character who's playing that doesn't have anything to do. The rest of the game they're fighting, they're useless. I mean, which is, it's fine to be useless and actually be able to try and do something, but you can't really do much as a mage. You can throw daggers and darts, and sometimes you'll get lucky. But it's I don't know. Magic users were not my cup of tea. Now, what made that better in this edition was that it was easier to have multiple characters at the same time to play. That not everybody did that, as far as I'm aware. I'm pretty sure there were people who did both, but you could have more than one player, which went back to kind of war games and stuff, where D&D was kind of a what's the word I'm looking for? Like
a mod?
Well, D&D was like narrowing it down to the individual people, and like it was still like a small group of people, but that was already a lot smaller of a game and like group than what like war games and like I can't think of the name. Scale mail?
Chainmail?
Chainmail. Thank you. Chainmail was doing at the time. So the overall mechanics of first edition, it was the original design, and so it was built around the very name of the game, Dungeons & Dragons. It was built pretty much only for hostile environments that were dungeons. Hello? Sorry. And so the entire game was built around like every mechanic you can find in the dungeon. There were mechanics for opening portcullises with strength checks and everything. There were full tables of every like little detail that you could find in dungeons, which was awesome. But the deficit of that at the time was that you couldn't really do a lot outside of dungeons. You couldn't do a lot of open air stuff except for fighting. Fighting and dungeons was essentially what it was built for. It wasn't really built for social interactions on the road, at least not yet. It got there, and I shouldn't say it wasn't designed for that, because it technically was, but in a very free kind of way. I can't think right now. It was designed so that it had a system for when you were in dungeons, and it had a system for battle, and it had a system for everything else, where that system was just, you do whatever you want. You're the DM. You create this world, which is great. It gives a lot of freedom, and it's why Rory really likes first edition, because it doesn't have a lot of necessarily oppressive stats that hold you back from doing things. The problem with that in some ways, though, is that you had no footholds to grasp onto. You had to create everything yourself, from the ground up. There was not a lot of extra books you could get the information from to create those other sorts of experiences beyond dungeons and battles.
Do we just hang them up?
What? No. I don't know how to use it still. So,
oh, darn.
Unfortunately, that's going to be how it is for now. The overall where was I? Yeah. Also, the game was very much more death-oriented than later editions. At least first and second edition were.
How so?
This is true in the current editions, but there were a lot more instances back then where one roll could kill you. One single roll could end your character's life, which that is true of nowadays gaming too, but it's a lot less common. Which back then it wasn't necessarily always as big a deal, because you had a lot of characters built parties themselves. They had their own like 3 guys that they controlled, so you had 2 other characters if one died that you could fall back on. What was that?
Just someone telling me how to use the phone.
All right. Was that Greg calling?
Greg is telling me how to use the phone.
Oh, lovely. So there were also a little thing, I pulled this up because this is kind of important. It's a big change between second edition and third edition that I wanted to mention, is THAC0. So THAC0 was how you hit your enemies back then. And I know it's a big change because a lot of people complained about it in third edition when it came about, so I wanted to address it right now. THAC0 essentially is, you have a number on your character sheet, and when you roll a die 20, you subtract your roll from your THAC0 number. And then the creature's AC, a lower number of AC is better. So if your score hits it or is below it, you hit that creature. Kind of complicated.
Yeah, just the complicated.
But I think it was designed in a way so that, kind of dungeon masters could kind of know when things are going to hit better than the players were. Nowadays we have the AC basic system, which is just, you have a number that you add onto your roll, die 20 roll, and the AC is higher that you're hitting. It's the same thing, but without, it's adding instead of subtracting. And the higher your AC is, the better, instead of the lower your AC is. Which is easier for players. But I think the reason that it was the way it was back then, where it was subtracting, is so that DMs could more easily like kind of know what was going on without necessarily having to tell the players. That was a little. To be fair, it was a little more accepted back then. I mean, Gary Gygax himself said the only reason you should be rolling in dice behind your thing is to hear the sound of the dice. He said himself that there was really a DM can say whatever they want. They don't have to roll the dice.
Yeah. That's fair.
There was a much more that's coined nowadays as a Gygaxian mindset, where back then there was more of the dungeon master is kind of the enemy. He's trying to kill you as a party. Whereas I feel like nowadays, no, you're not calling us Reed.
Oh, is that the person?
No, I don't think it was Reed, but they just asked if they could call us. But where was I? Nowadays, DMs are a little more, I wouldn't say friendly with the players, but a little less likely to just want to kill the players.
Oh, yeah, no.
Now, my dad didn't want to kill me and Rory, from what I could tell, but we were also young players, so I could see why he wouldn't necessarily want to kill us.
Also, maybe you're his sons, maybe.
Yeah, it's fine.
Maybe.
Sometimes fathers kill sons. No, I'm just kidding. It's not. We're not advertising that.
Oedipus, though.
Yeah, so like the reason that the game was built with more you do whatever you want in as far as outside of Dungeons and Battle was because they wanted to give more freedom to the dungeon master to decide those things. The game back then in first edition was very battle oriented, but also very resource and risk management oriented, which I feel like D&D has kind of slid away from with like certain elements. Like, if you're in a desert or a swamp, then DMs will be like, okay, now you need to worry about risk management. But in earlier editions, risk management was always something that you kind of had to watch. Which I feel like D&D has kind of moved away from because it's not as fun in most situations. No offense to the kind of mathematician style of D&D of the past, but resource and risk management isn't fun in a game for the most part. Usually, unless you do it creatively. But yeah, what were you saying?
Nothing. Not that we're in a
Says
swamp.
the person who gives you trench foot in a swamp. Well, yeah, don't dry your clothes off, okay? As far as creatures and content goes, the first edition obviously had a lot of the initial creatures that are still in the game today, like beholders and stuff like that. Beholders is a classic monster, of course. Content-wise, first edition didn't have a lot of extra books to go along with it. There was a lot less content, and back then, there were only 3 real true books for first edition that were the basic, that were the all-encompassing of the book. Those sort of things came more in second edition. Second edition was a big explosion, and we'll talk about it. The world, again, there wasn't much of a world at this time. It was just a free world that you could build yourselves. There weren't campaign structures and stuff. There are 3 or 4 people messaging me at once. I'm sorry if I can't answer all of the people messaging in to me for the show. Also, the rest of the audience can't see your texts and stuff, so you'll forgive me if I can't answer them properly on air. So second edition came. And second edition had 4 classes, which were warrior, wizard, priest, and rogue. And once again, this is what I think what Dad played with us is more modeled upon. And then those were subdivided into warrior had paladin, barbarian, ranger, which were subclasses that you could fall into. Yep. Wizard had mage, which was just the wizard. Mage. Or you could be a specialist wizard, like you could go into different types of schools like necromancy or illusions or evocation, stuff like that. Priests, there was cleric, there was druid, and then there were specialist priests, and I didn't look into what that exactly meant. I assume it's a specialist priest for like a certain pantheon that you bring into your game if you want to work that out with your DM. But yeah. And then there was rogue, which was split into thief and bard.
That's great.
And back in these early editions, bard was fairly useless at the time. But it existed still. And this is when you could go up to 20 levels now.
20 levels.
As for overall mechanics, first of all, second edition just kind of smoothed a lot of things out from first edition and made things a little more
simpler,
simple, but also like more content for stuff that people want to do.
Deeper. You
can more openly have one character if you want to. More people started doing one character things, but you could also still have 3 people. Me and Rory had 3 characters that we controlled for the game that we played with Dad. It brought in a lot more content with expansive modules detailing specific worlds and creatures like Fiend Folio or Unearthed Arcana. You had things for like the planes and stuff like that, certain elements and magics and stuff like that. Also, Dragon Magazine really popularized D&D at this time and had like it had like little additions you could put in, and you had to kind of keep up with the Dragon magazines to know everything that you could put into the game. And Dragon Magazine still kind of I think it exists today. I think it's under a different name.
Like what part of Dragon Magazine? Because they have their website now that they use.
Okay.
And then for testing out new stuff, they have Unearthed Arcana.
Yeah. But I think it's still kind of around for 5e stuff. But yeah, the rules are similar to first edition, but not quite as dungeon focused necessarily. You can move it out to more worlds. The world has expanded a bit. There's still not one like major world that you can use for everything, but you do have sub-worlds you can go into, such as the Greyhawk campaigns, Dark Sun campaigns, which introduce one of my favorite things from old D&D, which is the 3 Kreen and stuff like that. And you have the Dragonlance worlds. And that's something that also popularized building the world as well as the Dragonlance novels and other novels that started to be written around the world of D&D, which was a cool thing. It's similar to how people write novels about like the Star Wars universe, you know? Yeah.
Which none of which are canon now.
There's not a lot more to talk about with second edition because it's majorly the same as first edition, just more smoothed over in from what I can tell and from my opinion of playing it. Yes. But then we have 3.5, which is.
I think we should go into maybe some PSAs before we get into some juicy additions.
Why are these ones more juicy, Brad? Are you dissing the old editions?
I'll be completely honest. I've never played first or second edition, so I just don't know them.
Now you know a little bit more about them. Play a PSA, please. All right, moving on to 3.5, which is my favorite edition. It's the first books that I found and kind of got into D&D with and kind of soaked over the monster manuals of those, which are my favorite part of D&D, are monsters. But for classes and races, it has 11 main classes, mainly the ones that you've heard of from the past, adding on the sorcerer class, which is a little different from wizard in that it's bloodline based instead of studying magic based. You have 7 races, which are like elf, half elf, human, dwarf, gnome, halfling, and half orc. Moving on from that, I will admit starting off strong in my favorite edition, classes suck. Classes suck in 3.5. They're not good. They're too general. They are very blank slates that have very little built into the actual classes. But the game is more based around very expansive customization options in the form of feats, skills, spells, stuff like that, and magic items, stuff like that. It's more built around what you find in the world in-game.
3.5 is very good for individual character customization.
It's the best for individual character customization, I would argue. It's the easiest to create a real-life character in.
I feel like Pathfinder's pretty close, but we can touch on that more.
That's true.
Later.
Little, yeah. Sorry. But yeah, it has extra class. It has a lot of content, so it has extra classes as well beyond the main book, as well as a prestige class system that was a very good concept, and I think originally did a good job, but ended up being a little too crazy and too convoluted.
We can touch on that when
it was a little too based upon what you've already built, if that makes sense. Like, you had to build up to getting a prestige class, and then when you got the prestige class, it didn't offer. Some of them didn't offer you a lot more.
Oh.
But anyway, as for creatures and content, this introduced AC, as we talked about. This is when AC became the only thing. It was be a base attack bonus in armor class instead of THAC0, which is to hit armor class 0 and armor class. It became BAB in armor class. So armor class got introduced where AC, it needs to be higher now for it to be better.
Which is the combat system that we still use today.
Yep, it's this combat system that D&D has used since. For creatures and content, this is why 3.5 is my favorite edition. So much content that you can either choose to use or not to use. It has basically some book for pretty much everything you can find. If you can't find it, you can probably find it in Pathfinder. But it has like a book all about the seas and like ocean travel and stuff. It has a book all about deserts. It has a book all about cold environments, which is... It just has a book pretty much for anything that you want to do in the game, which I feel like no edition since has really tackled as much stuff as 3.5 tackled. And so you have a table, or at least a basic system for pretty much everything you want to do, and if not, you have a basic system for that you can work off of to create new things with. So, and it's very free. 3.5 is incredibly free, I would argue. And you can decide to use those things or not to create so much more than what I would argue 5e or 4e can give you. So far. Now, 5e still has some time to get up to that point, but we'll get into that later. I will admit, it introduced the psionics system, which at this point was terrible.
Yeah.
It's really bad. We don't really talk about the psionic system. It's really not been perfected in any edition sense either.
It's using your mind to do things.
Yeah. It has one of the best creature collections in my opinion. It has 5 monster manuals, which is more than most other editions at this point, except for Pathfinder, which has 6 bestiaries. The only problem with the monster manual and the Fiend Folio in this is there are a few monsters that probably could use a bit more tuning and once-overing. That's true of every edition. And I think this is one of the best ones still for monsters. But it's the reason I got into D&D is looking at the monsters in 3.5. It's still a really good system for monsters. And the monsters, I think, are the best built for their system of any game, in my opinion. For the most part, anyway. 5e, I could argue as well, but 5e doesn't have as much creatures. We'll get into that later. 3.5 I really love also because it's the first hint of starting to move away from alignment forcing creatures. So what that means is, like, in earlier editions, if you were an orc, you were evil. And I'm sorry, this might be a little, like, breaking of fantasy worlds, but that doesn't make sense. There is no race in the universe that is all evil. If you take a baby orc and raise it in a human home, it's not going to turn out evil. I mean, unless the humans are evil. But they're good humans. it doesn't make sense, and I feel like it's too black and white sort of territory. And 3.5 thankfully started to move away from that with like introducing half orcs and stuff like that. 5e does a little better job of it later on, but this is the start of that mindset, which I really like. And also, another part of starting that mindset is in the monster manuals. Instead of saying it's chaotic evil, most of them say usually chaotic evil, giving a dungeon master the ability to say, actually, in this case, it's not evil. Now, there are a few exceptions, like demons are always chaotic evil because they were created to be chaotic evil. I mean, in my homebrew, I changed that a bit, but it makes sense in the context of the main D&D world. Yeah, so it starts to do that. It has a expansive world if you want it. That is just, there is no basic world for 3.5. Most of the editions don't. It's not until you get into later editions that you start to have a basic D&D world. It has that you can, but pretty much it's just an open free world for you. Though it does have massive expansion packs for 2 lands that it created called Eberron and Faerun, and both of those are really interesting if you look into them. Also, it has more like eclectic sort of things. It brings back the Desert Sun campaign in 3.5, and it also has the 5 Rings campaign, which has spun into its own RPG, sort of. And it might have been kind of an RPG before then, but it was connected to Dungeons & Dragons. 5 Rings is an oriental adventure sort of Dungeons & Dragons game that focuses on like samurai and an honor sort of system. Then we have Pathfinder. Now, Pathfinder was built to appease the people who didn't want to move on from 3.5 yet. It was made to fix 3.5. And I think it broke 3.5, in my opinion. Now, that's not to say there aren't good things about Pathfinder. And I'll get to the good things when I get to like the world. But the classes are really good. They're really well-designed classes. They're poorly designed for the game they're in. They are too overpowered for the monsters and stuff that are in Pathfinder. And the reason for that is because you have way more battles in Pathfinder than you did in 3.5, where you have multiple battles in a row in a day. Because, well, we'll get to that later. There are a lot of good options as well for every class. You can choose something like from multiple options pretty much every level, but it does get too much sometimes.
So Pathfinder has I want to argue it has the most content with it, just how much details are in everything.
It would be hard to compare 3.5 and Pathfinder. They both have so much.
It's just so deep, and you know everything, and everything's written down.
Pathfinder might win, because it has been around longer at this point.
Yeah.
Technically.
So Pathfinder is the most detailed-oriented, customizable thing, but it just gets so complicated.
Well, yes, and that wouldn't be a problem if it were all in add-on stuff, but in the basic book, there's too many choices for a beginning game. It's a lot.
Hey, Drew, you tried to run a Pathfinder campaign.
Yes, I did, and I found out that the overall mechanics of Pathfinder, and the reason it's not one of my favorites necessarily, is that it is essentially a battle simulator. Now, I will argue it is a good battle simulator. It's really good at what it does, but it's not what I want from a role-playing game. It's basically the same as 3.5 in terms of combat, but there are a lot more things that it has created over time that feed into combat. So, this is where Pathfinder gets really good for me. It has the best creature collection of any edition. It has the largest, and all of the creatures are really well designed. I think that they would be better designed for a 3.5 game because they're a little underpowered in terms of the player characters in Pathfinder, but they are exceptionally well designed, in my opinion. And I use a lot of them in our homebrew game. In fact, I would say I actually use more Pathfinder monsters a lot of times than I do 3.5 monsters. They are really good. I really like them. As well as that, The one deficit of their creature collection is they do have to drop a few creators because technically they're not quite Dungeons and Dragons, and so they had to drop a little that are only owned by Dungeons and Dragons. So they had to drop out Beholders, Mind Flayers, Yuan Ti for a few to start off with, and they replaced those kind of with their own subgenre of monsters, like the Serpent Folk, which are essentially the same thing as the Yuan Ti. They still have the Drow and stuff like that. But yeah. Or some people say drow. I still don't know to this day which is the correct pronunciation. But yeah, it's good. They replaced the Mind Flayers with Neophilids. It's a really good world. And also the world is really good. It's the first edition that kind of has its own world map that's just the basic world map, and it's called Golarion. The world is called Golarion. And it's really interesting. All of the countries are so well designed. It's probably the best design of one of the editions that of any of the games, in my opinion, in terms of the creation of cities and stuff. The problem with it, all of that design, all of that structure is all made for combat. Oh, we have mental illnesses and madnesses, and these are the statistics for them. These are the statistics of how they affect you in combat. Oh, we have this special drug from this weird Egyptian city that's very specific to this city. Here's how this drug affects you in combat. Oh, we have this cool structure that's really well built, and this is how you're going to battle in it. Everything is built for the perspective of we're gonna battle in it, which and it's all really well designed. I can't argue that all that stuff isn't well designed and that the culture and everything of Pathfinder isn't amazing, but when everything is built around the fact that we know the creators are thinking, all right, we're creating all this stuff so that we can have this specific battle encounter. It's like, all right, but why don't you just create it for some sort of social encounter or something, or just cultural experience? Ugh, it gets exhausting, especially when you have sieges and stuff, which we had. And again, it's a really well designed battle system. A lot of the modules. It doesn't feel too grindy in a lot of the modules. Ours felt a little grindy because there was little I could do with just orc after orc. But every battle situation, thankfully, it does have good design of the area around you, and the entities are usually different enough that every battle is interesting. But it tries to go back to the Dungeon Crawl First Edition and make it better. In a way, but also has this expansive world that we're gonna use for combat. It's just, it's a little annoying sometimes. Other thing about the world, 3.5, by the way, second edition brought in the planner system, the different planes of existence that you could go to. Pathfinder is the first one that has a different plane system that is not as good as the plane system of Dungeons and Dragons, but still interesting. It's more alignment based and afterworld based than the plane system of regular Dungeons and Dragons. Now we have 4th edition.
Pathfinder was based off of 3.5 kind of being open source, and Pathfinder went on its own genre and anything. And Wizards of the Coast, the original company from D&D, Wizards
of the Coast also owns Pathfinder, just so you know.
They do?
I think so, yeah. I'm pretty positive. But yeah. Really anyway, continue.
But anyways, because if they do, that might have ruined my whole tangent.
Anyway, continue on.
Let me just see who owns Pathfinder. Give me a second.
I'm pretty sure their site has a little thing in the corner insignia that has Wizards, that is the Wizards of the Coast sign.
Give me a second. Okay, so anyways.
All right.
So there's another edition called
4th edition.
4th edition, which
Rory just said it is Wizards. Pathfinder owns
All right,
Wizards.
Forget about the tangent that I was going to go on. Anyways, so 4th edition is a thing. 4th edition is a thing. It's also very heavily combat focused, but one way how this is
different,
or in my preference a little bit better, is it is so much more clearer and simplified, and it's so much, the combat is much more streamlined than a lot of percentile die. And
it's
rolls.
very tactically based, right? Like where everyone has a role.
Yeah, like everyone.
The problem I see with that is, do you have to have all of those roles? Does that mean that you have to have those roles in your party?
I don't think so. I think it would be a fun tactical challenge to not have some of them. But even the enemies, all of the people that you face have different roles, like minions.
So 4th edition is much more video gamey, you could say,
is much more video
in which you have 4 different roles. You can be a leader, and that is a cleric or a warlord. You have a defender, which is a fighter or a paladin. You have a striker, which is a ranger, rogue, or warlock. And you have a controller, which is a wizard. Yes. You also have many other classes, because there are 2 other entire player's handbooks.
Yeah, and any person can come up with any of these to a table, and it'll work out. And
I've heard people say that that 4E is the best balanced game of any of the editions.
Oh, yeah.
That's one thing that I've heard is one of the best things about 4E. I would argue it is for the first player's handbook. The second player's handbook, you get classes that are underpowered and overpowered in comparison to the others, including, which is one of the things I have as a pet peeve against 4E. The druid is awful.
How is the druid awful?
It's awful.
Good and played?
No, not really. But I haven't looked at it in a while. But I just remember reading it a long time ago, and I was not impressed.
See, so I was given a handbook, and I was told this was 5E. It was actually 4E. 4E was the first handbook that I've read the whole thing of, and I just...
4E is also...
easy.
The problem with 4E also, not necessarily a problem, is that it's different from every other edition. 3.5 and 5E are kind of connected in that 5E is just a simplification of 3.5 in many ways. But 4E is completely different. There are so many things that are completely different than any other edition. For instance, just a small thing, but monsters are built much differently.
Oh yeah, variants.
They also have levels instead of challenge rating, which is a small thing, but still, it annoys me. It's we're just gonna make it so video game people can understand this. You also have 30 levels as a character. It's the only E edition where you have 30 levels instead of 20, and that's the base levels. You can obviously go over in any edition, but the base levels you have 30 levels. It also has something that replaced prestige classes a bit called Paragon Paths, and I have no idea what that is. I was hoping you could explain that.
So Paragon Paths, they are very similar to prestige classes, as in after you get so far in,
you can take on a Paragon Path.
Yeah.
Are they good?
It's just a retitle of the prestige class, basically.
But in this case, you have to take them.
Maybe?
In 4E, you have to take them. It's kind of like subclasses of 5E. You have to choose a archetype in 5E. In 4E, I think you have to take them, whereas in 3.5, which was a problem with 3.5, I will admit, you could choose to take them, and so some characters would choose them and be better than others. But
yes.
But I think that also, I will argue, goes to the whole thing of you're not all the same character, and some of you might actually be more powerful than one another.
Yeah.
That's life. In terms of creatures and contents, I've heard and read that it made races a lot more interesting in general, especially tiefling and stuff.
Yeah, they gave races more abilities.
5E is hailed as having great races, but from what I can tell, 4E is what really pushed that lore of races. The world, again, it made races better overall. The one thing that annoys me about 4E is it tried to do something new different with the planes, where there was like this spell plague event essentially in the world of D&D, where like the planes got all rearranged, and it messed up the planner system quite a bit in my mind. The only good thing that came of it is that it did add the Feywild, which is used in 5e as well, and the Feywild is very interesting in playing and to add on. But for the most part, it got rid of a lot of the planes, at least in many ways. It didn't get rid of them, but made them a lot smaller in content, if that makes sense, because they were all kind of subplanes of the Astral Sea and or the plane of Limbo. Not Limbo, Elemental Chaos. 5e. Should we move on to 5e?
No.
Okay, so 5e also had the 11, went back to the basic 11 classes that 3.5 had. It essentially tried to be 3.5 just simplified. It kind of ignored a lot of the stuff from 4e.
It did take a bit from 4e, though.
It took a bit in terms of lore.
It took lore. It took, like, a more simplistic mindset, if that makes sense. Like,
right.
If you didn't know, 4e and 5e were able to get a lot of new players into the game.
Did 4e? 4e did bring a lot of new players in. It also lost a lot of players.
It did do that.
5e has brought players back. 5e has the 11 from 3.5, and it added on Warlock as a main class. One thing that's really cool about classes in 5e, in my opinion, is that there's no longer an alignment necessity. In older editions, you had to be a certain alignment for some of the classes. For instance, you had to be one of the most heinous to me was you had to be one of the neutral alignments to be a druid. You had to be true neutral, neutral good, chaotic neutral, lawful neutral, or neutral evil to be a druid, which didn't make any sense to me. Also, you had to be lawful good for a paladin, which I can see why it got rid of. I like the idea of paladins being able to do whatever they want, because really paladins in the real ill life were kind of terrible people and would not be considered lawful good at all. So they were probably chaotic evil. I would say in keeping with the old D&D games, though, they should have at least made it where you couldn't be a chaotic paladin, in my opinion. Like, you can be a lawful evil paladin, and I get that. I get that you have the anti-paladin sort of scheme going on, but I'm not in favor of, like, chaotic neutral paladins and stuff like that, even if you are serving a god that's chaotic neutral or whatever. I don't know. It doesn't fit the theme of paladins for me. But I do agree with the fact that they made barbarians able to be lawful races, because, to be honest, you can easily make a barbarian that's a lawful entity, because, like, that would be your spirit guardian of the tribe of barbarians. That can still be a barbarian, ancestral guardian barbarian. And stuff like that. There is still a code to most barbarian tribes, even in the real world there were. So yeah, you could be a lawful barbarian, in my opinion. It has a lot of cool races. There's a lot more choices for races in 5e, from what I can tell.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if that was true in the basic set, but there are a lot of race options. I will say, I will give 5e the credit. I fight you on 3.5 being better than 5e. It has the best classes of any edition. It's designed its classes really well over a long period of time. I would say it has meh customization in terms of feats, skills, and stuff like that.
It does have less customization.
Yeah.
But
3.5 wins in customization, 5e wins in classes, basic classes, I would say. Overall mechanics, again, it dropped alignment restrictions. It went back to 3.5 mostly, but simplified a lot of things. For instance, it made the advantage-disadvantage system instead of having to subtract and add 2 rolls, which I still think you should subtract and add to some rolls based on stuff you have. But advantage and disadvantage is also a very good system. It's simplified in that way. It was the first edition to change dying mechanics. It made the death save system.
Yes.
In earlier editions, if you went a certain number of points below 0, you died. In 5e, what happens is, once you go below 0, you have to make death saves. And if you fail a death save, the death saves 3 times, that is when you die. And some people say it's a lot harder to die in that system, but I like it because it's a little more random and, in my opinion, realistic to how things would be in real life. You can't really predict it as much, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Plus, I love the thematic story of someone like bleeding out on the ground and a healer running and healing them last
right
minute.
Whereas if you're in 3.5 or 2nd edition or any other edition, in earlier editions, if you go below like -5 hit points by any attack, you're dead.
Oh.
Yeah. No, I'm sorry, it's not -5, it's -9. But still, so many people die. That's a lot of death. 5e makes it a lot harder to die, but then that makes deaths more emotional, in my opinion, and better, in my opinion. Which is why even when I do like basic 3.5, I use death save system. I use death save system in it, no matter what. I think looking at any edition prior to 5e, it's a miracle. I think the death system in earlier editions is one of the worst things about every other edition but 5e, in my opinion. Unless you're specifically trying to do a game that's hardcore, like I don't know. But in terms of creatures and content, they don't.
It has less than
it.
Average.
It does, and it's been 6 years now, and like I get it. They're being a lot more cautious with the content for this edition, which makes the content usually very good, but it is a little. They need to pick it up a bit. They need to pick it up a bit because they've been a company for a long time now, and they've been designing things for so long now. I would feel like they can more confidently make stuff a little quicker than they're doing these days.
Well, they do keep a lot hidden in their modules.
I guess. I don't like the Unearthed Arcana thing of like, oh, this is a playtest either. It's a little too video gamey for me. Yeah. I'll also wish there were more true monster expansions. Like even 4e had at least up to Monster Manual 3. 5e kind of has monster manuals,
like 2,
but it doesn't call them that. And also, they honestly don't have a lot of monsters in comparison to the monster manuals of other editions. Volo's Guide to Monsters had very few monsters in comparison to old editions.
Races.
I guess. Cool. So did all the other monster manuals in bestiaries. It's not any different.
But one thing that 5e does touch a lot on is the story and everything revolving around the characters.
I suppose.
Like it's been like Xanathar's Guide, if we want to go into details, half the book is dedicated to like 6 main sets of monsters and how they operate, and Mordecai's Tomb of Foes goes horribly in depth with like the war between demons and devils.
I think you're reading the wrong books if you don't think other editions did that.
See, I haven't read any other editions.
Yeah, other editions definitely did that. But especially modules sometimes went into it a bit and had like extra stuff you could add into the game at the end of them. Now,
I just want to remind people, since we're over our time span, but just need to make sure that everyone knows, this is WCCX Waukesha 104.5 FM, and this is D&D with B&D, talking about editions.
Yep. The 5e did refix the planner system, which is like, okay, we made a mistake in 4th edition by negating these. Like, they kind of dissed 4th edition by making it exactly like it was in 3.5, except for the elemental planes are a little smaller, and they're in the elemental chaos now. Which, of all the planes, I don't know why they would choose to do that for those planes, because those are the planes that are explored the most of most planes. But whatever, it's cool. It has a very cool. It is the first like mainstream Dungeons and Dragons game that has a main world to it. It has a map essentially.
Yes.
It's very cool world from what they've released about it. They need to release more about it. They're very sparse in the releases they've made about the different cities in this world so far, even about like Waterdeep and stuff.
Hey, Drew.
Some of that stuff you can find secretly tucked away into like Dragon magazine stuff, but they need more stuff.
Drew, I got the module for a game. I haven't been able to finish all of the backstory for Waterdeep.
Right, Bradley, and like that's the only city, that's the only book for a city that they have so far, of the like dozen cities that they have in the world, major cities. Yeah. That's the only one they have a book for so far, and they're 6 years in.
So 5e doesn't have a lot of content, but it has a lot of set systems for DMs to go and make their own content.
Sure. I mean, if you want to modify 3.5 stuff, what do you mean by that?
No, I mean like it tells you how to create campaigns.
This is what annoys me is Wizards of the Coast are doing this thing where they're, I mean, I guess it doesn't annoy me. I shouldn't say that because it does give people the ability to contribute without necessarily having to be a part of the team and help. Is that they're having lots of people like recreate 3.5 monsters in 5e stats for them right now.
Okay.
Did you not know that? That was the site that you showed me.
That was the site.
Yeah, they were mainly focused on having people give content for recreating 3.5 monsters in 5e. Because 3.5 monsters are awesome, which is understandable. Like, they should bring those things into 5e because everybody loved 3.5 and all of those monsters. But yeah, but I feel like, why aren't you doing that yourself? Where is this time or not using to do this going to? Because there's no content coming out.
They're bringing out a book every year.
Yeah, modules. I don't want adventures. I want content to be used by like dungeon masters and stuff.
Content.
I don't know. But that being said, we are going to go into our overall consensus of what the best editions are. And I'll give a little bit of a spiel for each one. First edition. It's very heavily battle-oriented and dungeon-oriented for me. It's a little too beginning quality. I appreciate it for starting the trend of Dungeons and Dragons and everything. But for me, it is 6th on my list of 7.
For me, I don't really know first edition well. When it first came out, it kind of required you to have 2 other games with it. So I'm not the biggest fan of that idea, but yeah, it's 7 for me, sadly.
Okay. Second edition smoothed a lot of things over, released a lot more content in comparison to first edition, really kind of started to popularize D&D. For me, especially because of nostalgia from playing it with my dad, it's one of my favorites. Third favorite for me of the 7.
Yeah. Second edition, I don't really know it, so it's my 6th favorite.
Fair. 3.5, my favorite edition, has so much customization and so much content involved in it. It is my second favorite of the 7.
And 3.5, it has a lot of details and it has a lot of rules with it that you can follow and make great things with it. But I sometimes think that it's too much to read. I'm a lazy person most of the time, and I just want simplicity. So I have it as my 4th favorite.
Pathfinder. Pathfinder is all about being a battle simulator, and I can't fault it too much because as much as I dislike the incessant need for battle, I cannot deny that it is a very good battle simulator. It is 5th for me of the 7.
It is also 5th for me. It's more complex than 3.5. They have more things. A lot of battle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
4E. 4E is a weird one for me. I haven't played a lot in 4E, but it is very video gamey, too simplistic for me, and very video gamey, which alienates me as a dungeon master, especially because it's very different in design than any of the other editions. It's just there are a few really cool things I like about 4E content wise, but for the most part, it is my least favorite. That being said, I still like it. There's not an edition that I don't like. It's 7th for me of the 7, but
4th edition. I love simplicity. I might play a little bit too many tactics games, so it does appeal kind of nice. And it was the first one that I've read, so a little nostalgia factor for me. So it's my 3rd favorite.
5th edition. I rip on 5th edition a lot, because Brad really likes 5th edition, and my favorite is 3.5, and there's a constant war between 3.5 and 5e, because 3.5 is all about complexity and having a lot out of content, and 5e is all about simplicity and having the bare minimum for DMs to go on, but also being a well-designed system. But it does rank above most of the other editions, only being beat out of the editions by 3.5 and 2nd edition for nostalgia for me. It is my 4th favorite of the 7, ranking in the middle.
Yes. 5th edition, I love it so much. It's a simple edition I just like simplicity in all my
I would argue it's still a little more complicated than 4e, though.
Yeah. But 5e expands on the social and kind of background for the characters, which helps newer players get into role-playing more, which I thoroughly enjoy because more people means more fun. So it is my 2nd favorite.
And that's it, right? That's all there is. Wait, you didn't have a first favorite, Brad.
Did we forget How to Count to 1 again?
What is? Why didn't you have a first favorite? Oh, that's right. Because the first favorite is homebrew. Homebrew is where you take the parts you like from different editions and you make your own game.
Yes.
It's what D&D was designed for you to create your own experience with and create your own world. And that's the game that my main game is in, Secretia. It's all homebrew. It takes a lot from 3.5, monsters from Pathfinder a lot of times, and some elements of 5e. It takes like small elements from other editions, but it's all homebrew. It's taking the best of what you like from all the different editions, because there are bad parts and there are good parts of all of the editions. So the only way to rectify that and make the best thing for you is to make your own game that uses a lot of the rules from the others, but make your own game. Now, a warning to that, you can make an awful homebrew game if you're not careful. There are so many people, for the most part, the most people leave D&D because of homebrew games that were not designed well. So be sure, if you're going to make a homebrew game, to let your players know kind of what you're making for them. But that would be my favorite edition, is homebrew. Just the conglomeration of the best parts of all of the editions. The world that you design yourself. But yeah. That is all that we have today. Once again, this is WCCX, Waukesha 104.5 FM, and this is D&D with B&D, saying a lot to nobody.
Have a good night. We got this down, Drew. Sorry I didn't research details of 4E more. I went more into the culture aspect and how it plays. Oh. Oh. I really want chapstick. Where's my hat? Where's my hat? Good times, little McGill. So, my brother-in-law kept on saying that he would call in one of these days and mess with me. Might have been